very much, Derek, Wolfgang, and Connell. So I'll just take a quick moment to say that the video of the seminar, podcast, and all PowerPoint presentations will be available online by tomorrow. So if you want to also revisit them, then you can just go online and check them out. Right now we'll move to a Q&A session. So what we'll do is we'll take questions in groups of threes. If you have a very specific question for a specific speaker, please let us know. I'll ask the speakers to move up to the table. And please, keep your questions brief and introduce yourself for the sake of the in-room audience and also for our virtual audience. Okay, so does anyone have a question? We'll start over here.
Margo Stiles from Oceana. And I'm curious if... Oh. Hi, this is Margo Stiles from Oceana, and a number of you mentioned measuring and evaluation. Do you have any good examples that we could learn from of measures of resilience?
Any other questions on that side? Alexander?
Alexander Stein from IFPRI here. I've got a question also about the monitoring and the measurement. And I wonder if you thought about the costs that are involved. I mean, there must be a trade-off of how much detail you want to measure and to capture and the costs of that whole thing, and whether you couldn't spend that money on other interventions. So just to get an idea of the trade-offs there. Thank you.
I'll stick to this side of the room and then move over there for the next round. Okay.
Hey, I'm Scott Weathers. I'm an intern at 8th grade. And my question is for Connell. I'm curious, you mentioned the randomized control trial that you guys are running, and given that I work at 8th grade, we're very excited that you guys are running that. So my question is, I'd like to get your sense of how can NGOs and other organizations try to investigate the effectiveness of their programs through randomized control trials, and how can we plan on using more of them, or is that a goal worth accomplishing, do you think?
Okay, thank you. So 3 questions, 2 on monitoring and evaluation, the examples and costs, and then the last one on randomized control trials. Connell, why don't we start with you since that last question was directed to you?
Just on that, thanks Scott for that question. We've had a lot of arguments about randomized control trials in the organization because of the costs of them. We've decided that we're going to do them in particular programs of particular interest. So we're going to do a small number of them with reputable research organizations because they are expensive. I think it links back to the previous question about trade-offs and costs. I think if you're trying to push out the boundaries or really trying to get proof of concept or, really prove an evidence base around something, you need to invest in that level of evidence building. I mean, the example I gave from Kenya is a really good, that's where the link came to doing the RCT in Chad. We know what we did was effective in Kenya, but we couldn't prove it because we hadn't invested in the evidence base. And that's why we decided we would try to do this in Chad. We're a very silly organization. We always try to do things in the hardest possible places. And believe me, Chad is not easy in this sense. But I do think that, I certainly don't think they're appropriate for all work, and I think you need to be very selective about how you do them. And it kind of goes back to the nature of systemic reviews, that while I think the systemic reviews are really useful in terms of understanding what works and what doesn't work, there's always the contextual issue, and things have to be applied contextually. We also have 2 models, for example, where we're not doing randomized control trials, but we're doing high-level qualitative research, because I think something like the surge capacity model, for example, is one of them. You need to do that qualitatively with a health department, and it doesn't make it easy to do it in an RCT sense. Just going back then to the other 2 questions, I think the measures and evaluation, practical measures of resilience, we're not experts in this. I think, as an NGO, and I think this relates to the second question from the IFPRI person, I generally take the approach as an NGO that we're better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. In a sense, there is a trade-off to be had in terms of data collection and how much you spend on it. In terms of measures, no, I think that's partly what we're trying to do in Chad, is to work out what kinds of, we're looking at coping strategies index, for example, which is a composite measure. We're looking at a number of unusual things, like, for example, where families stop fostering their children out, which is some really interesting types of indicators that you could look at, that are actually probably reasonably good proxies of resilience. I think it is proxies we'll have to work with. It's going to be, I mean, Derek will talk about it. It's a very difficult concept to measure. I think we know that from Christopher Benne's paper just recently. Just in terms of the trade-offs then, in terms of the cost, I think that's it. We find ourselves as an NGO collecting a phenomenal amount of data and surveys, and we're finding we're only analysing and utilising about 20% of it. And I think we need to get much smarter. I think in terms of resilience, and particularly to chronic food crisis here, it is around, I think, looking at particular contexts, defining which contexts are probably most illustrative, and sort of using sentinel sites and finding out maybe how to use data and more cost effectively from those. That would be my feeling on it.
Derek or Wolfgang, do you have any comments on either of the three questions?
I guess there's very little to add, to say, both in terms of the actual example that Concern is providing in the case studies, as well as in your general statements. You're both showing the problem we're facing, but also the opportunities that are out there. And as a matter of fact, a lot of those indicators of resilience have to be context specific. I mean, you've mentioned the issue of fostering our children. If you go to Madhya Pradesh, for instance, to the Dalit communities in India, where the women of the households are forced to migrate regularly to the cities for months and months. You know, this would be another indicator if that migration pattern, for instance, is being reduced. If they have to for shorter time, migrate for shorter time, or even not at all. The issue is they will have to be context specific. But I agree, we'll have to work on those indicators together with research institutions harder. Because there's no alternative. We are being asked for proof of evidence in terms of impact, both by the general public and by the donors. Luckily enough, donors are also now willing to invest in increased monitoring, evaluation, post evaluation, which is also something that doesn't happen often enough. I guess that this is one of the major fields that where we have to invest in.
Yeah, so I'll address the largely the first question. I'll talk a little bit about costs of measuring resilience. So the specific question of measuring food insecurity resilience, I think, you know, we have a lot of answers. Obviously, measuring nutrition is nutrition is pretty well established. Anthropometric indicators, more indirectly, various food security indicators like dietary diversity. We've seen a lot of experimentation in the last 10 years with different food security indicators, subjective indicators, and so on. More broadly, though, understanding the process of resilience building or vulnerability requires measuring a bunch of other things. It requires measuring not only the impact of shocks, but the coping strategies, how people change their assets, how they deplete their assets in response to shocks. And it requires measuring a lot of different things at different levels too. So yeah, we have to measure nutrition for individuals, we have to measure household factors, and I think this focus on community responses is also really important. In terms of costs, one thing you can automatically say is that people always underinvest in measurement because it's a public good. In terms of kind of the nutrition surveillance systems, which I think is the closest kind of tool we have to what we want to have in the future in terms of surveillance systems, you'd have to ask Helen Keller International, but I think in Bangladesh, I believe a HKI staff member told me it was about $1 million a year. In more difficult environments where these guys work in the Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa, it would be more expensive. But flip that around and think about how much we spend in total on relief, humanitarian aid, development aid every year. This is a paltry sum that would greatly increase the efficiency of resources used in those areas.
Thank you, Derek. So next round of questions, maybe we'll start off this side of the room. I see a couple in the back.
Hi, Mark Constas, Cornell University. Just as an item of interest, since this isn't really a question, it's an item of interest since there's so much interest in resilience measurement. FAO and WFP, through the Food Security Information Network, has established a technical working group on resilience measurement. We've just had our first meeting last week in Rome. One of your members of IFPRI, John Hoddenot, is a member of that technical working group, and we'll be releasing 3 papers that hopefully will be addressing some of the questions that are raised here. We've done something which seemed monumental at the time. We had 17 people in a room who settled on a definition of resilience, and we're now moving to the next level of talking about metrics and empirical access points, reflecting on many of the questions that are raised here and points that have been mentioned in your talks. So just wanted to raise that as a point of interest. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just to follow up with Mark, my name's Tim Frankenberger. I'm with Tango International. I'm also on this technical working group, and we have also been working closely with Feed the Future on resilience measurement, and so there's a paper that's just going to be coming out on AgriLinks next week on measuring community resilience. So it's been vetted by a number of people, so we'll make that available for everybody next week. But I think what's important about this technical working group is that it represents not only research institutions like IFPRI and IDS is also on it, but it also has Tufts University, Cornell, Tulane, a number of different universities, as well as all the UN organizations, and NGOs are also represented on it. So I think the fact that we did come to consensus around a definition was an important one. That does allow us to have the metrics, that we can work on metrics now in relationship to that definition. And there are a number of working groups associated with this measurement effort, some that are focused on using existing data so we don't over-survey people. Another group is working on shocks and stresses, how to actually measure shocks and stresses more effectively, modules that you can include in existing questionnaires. And there's another group focused on systems. So as Derek was pointing out, you have resilience at multiple levels. So trying to understand the systems interactions that are going on at household, community, and agroecological systems, or social systems, or even market systems. And there's another group that is estimation models. So all the ag economists are in the room building these econometric models. And then the last group is also focused on qualitative measures and perception measures, and trying to make sure that we have good measurement of things like intangible social capital, but it's not easy to get sometimes through quantitative surveys.
Thanks very much. Over here, Sue. Thanks.
Thank you. Brian Greenberg with Interaction. First, I just wanted to applaud and endorse the call to reduce the gap between humanitarian assistance and development as an approach here. But it's not clear that, especially in the development side, that we have been using the right approaches to get at this kind of root problem. And so simply reducing the silos between the two of them may not get at the issue. And my question or suggestion to you is really, might we better go back essentially to the ecosystem theory around resilience and apply it as more than an analogy in this case, and think of reducing vulnerabilities, building resilience through landscape systems approaches and different kinds of production approaches in agriculture. The kinds of productivity-focused agricultural development approaches that we have taken towards livestock, for example, which often involve increases in livestock numbers, or production systems in agriculture, often have imposed additional environmental burdens on local landscapes. So I guess I want to suggest that if we take resilience seriously, it's a different and new agenda, and one which is outside the purview of traditional development. And so can we get to a deeper transformational approach through that, so that we're not constantly repeating the cyclical humanitarian assistance to development back to humanitarian assistance kinds of kinds of cycles that we've seen.
So I'll just take a moment to have one of our online questions be raised at this point, and then we'll go to answers and then do another round. Simone?
The question comes from Twitter user Anna F. Ramirez, and she asks, what is the potential for organic agriculture for high-value niche crops in developing countries for improving food and nutrition security?
Okay, thank you. So we have had 2 comments on the technical working group that was just created and the work they did defining resilience and doing other things. So if any of you want to comment on those 2 sets of comments. Then a question from Brian on will just reducing silos be enough and whether we need to move to a deeper approach. And finally, an online question about organic agriculture and high-value crops.
High-value crops, was it?
Derek?
High-value crops?
Yes.
I'm not sure how much I can comment on the latter. I imagine these issues are very context-specific. There's a long history, of course, to high-value crops, that they also present special problems for vulnerability, especially price fluctuations and so on. So an interesting question there, I guess, is how we can manage price risk for high-value crops. But I don't think I'm qualified to comment on the question of organic agriculture. Brian's comment saying maybe it's not just about silos, maybe you need to go back to, I think he used the term landscape focus. My perception is that a lot of ecological issues have indeed been neglected in some environments. I've heard experts on pastoralism make that statement in the context of Eastern Africa, that there used to be very good rangeland management systems in place, and those have really dilapidated over time. On the other hand, I don't think we can only focus on that. Resilience is a really broad issue. If you look at the way people are using coping strategies in those regions, they're engaging in non-farm work, they're migrating, they're increasingly dependent on markets as well. So we still need a fairly broad focus, I think.
Wolfgang.
Yeah, just let me continue. I mean, I wouldn't even, the issue, the 2 areas of development and relief. I don't think they're so segregated or separated from each other, like we sometimes think. Of course, over the last 20-25 years, there's been a lot of kind of interaction and trying to close the gap. Maybe a little bit too much focus on this LRRD paradigm, linking relief, rehabilitation, and development, and maybe not so much the other way around. When you go from relief, of course, you try to come up to longer-term solutions, but how much did we actually invest in making development work, real disaster prevention, disaster preparedness, and focusing on the resilience of the community? But at the same time, I'm not sure whether this traditional development is still existing. I think even the development is learning every year, the development community, the approaches that we use. I'm also not so sure that there's that big cleavage between, let's say, industrialized or high productivity agriculture on the one hand, on the other one, organic agriculture, organic farming. Again, it's context specific. Both Concern, I think, and Welthungerhilfe are focusing a lot on context-specific agriculture, and it has to be combined with natural resource, or generally resource management. Organic farming is usually very often the better solution. But on the other hand, if there is progress in increase of productivity through measures that go beyond, let's say, exploring traditional practices, why not look at those? Productivity is as needed as maybe a general level of improvement of agricultural production, which is resistant to not just price shocks, but also what you get out of a crop, even in difficult circumstances. When you have a crop that performs well in a good weather condition, it doesn't make a difference if it is not helpful if the crop fails under a drought condition. Okay, so you need to address that one as well.
Feel free.
So just say to Mark and Tim, thank you both for your comments. And I'm delighted. Let academics look at measurement of resilience, because we're not going to be able to do it. So we'll watch that space and contribute when we can. Brian, thank you. That's a really difficult question, a hard one. The one thing I would say on it is we talked with the European Commission on Monday this week. And Jean-Pierre Halcan is kind of the head of food nutrition security there. He was asked that question, which is again a tricky question. Is we have LLRD, we have DRR, we have climate change adaptation. What's new about resilience? And he made 3 points, which I think were quite interesting. He felt that discussing things or putting things in a resilience framework changed the way you had discussions with country level governments. And that he said he felt that they began to talk much more about root causes, or it forced much more of a discussion around root causes, which is essentially what you're getting at in terms of ecological terms of what are root causes and how do you address them. The 2 other points he made, which I think were interesting, was it forced people to begin to look at vulnerability assessments much more carefully. And the third one, which I think was interesting, was much more for humanitarian actors, that it forced them to think with longer term perspectives. Now, you could argue that that happens under some of the other frameworks as well, but I thought they were interesting, and I think that's perhaps one way to go. From our question on Twitter, again, a difficult question. I think maybe Wolfgang has answered it reasonably well. I don't know so much about organic farming, but we certainly do a lot of work on conservation agriculture, so low external input agriculture, as you can imagine. And I think in terms of reducing workloads and minimizing risk, I think in terms of ICRAF's work on greening the Sahel, for example, I think this is relevant, the conservation agricultural approach. I think it's hard to know then whether you look at high-level crops or high-value crops, I beg your pardon, are kind of double-edged, aren't they? They're high risk in some ways. If you've got the market and you can get more income from it, you can create a certain level of resilience from that, creating an asset base, but you're dependent on weather and being able to actually get the market price and all of that stuff. So in a sense, it's a tricky balance. That I think we talked about this issue about whether diversifying crops was essentially resilience building in itself, or whether there actually were other ways of creating resilience through becoming excellent at a particular livelihood strategy. So it's a hard one, I think.
Thank you, Conal. I noticed there was one question at the back. Rachel, we'll start with Rachel.
I'm Rajul Pandya-Loach with IFPRI. I have 2 questions for Conal and Wolfgang, and an advertisement. So first I want to come back to the Global Hunger Index for a moment. Your 2 institutions have been investing in the GHI, the Global Hunger Index, and I'm very curious, how has that in turn influenced the work that you do or the choices that you make, where to invest or what to work in or what not to work in? Is that translating back into selection of your countries, or graduating in or graduating out? And then coming back to the resilience, this whole conversation we've been having, Conal, you shared some very interesting lessons from the various countries you've been involved in. But one of the lessons I don't think I heard was, what does it mean for the organization itself in terms of building the capacity for resilience programming within Concern or within Welthungerhilfe? Have you noticed that you have to basically also reprogram differently to be able to in turn do more resilience type of work? What type of skills does it call for at the country level and so forth? Because I think even as we all talk about resilience, are we then equipped or do we need different type of capacity to be able to be effective in doing resilience type of work? And given all of the interest in resilience, if all of you don't already know, we have, and this is the commercial, if you don't know that we have a resilience-oriented event also on Monday evening, 4 o'clock, you're more than welcome to come. It's investing in building the resilience of smallholders. We continue the conversation there on resilience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel, very much. Next question, back over there.
Hi, my name is Danielle Resnick. I'm a research fellow here at IFPRI. And I just wanted to ask, among the many interesting points I heard today, one kind of underlying tension I heard was first that poor governance can be a cause of global hunger, which came out of some of Derek's discussions earlier. But then in the 2 case studies, or the multiple case studies we heard later on, most of the discussion of governance was in terms of capacity building, working with governments, local governments in particular. And so I'm kind of wondering if you've looked at governance from an incentive approach. I mean, some of the problems here of poor governance and high levels of hunger are actually related to disincentives of governments to actually invest in particular areas. So I'm interested, both from Wolfgang and Connell, if from some of your own fieldwork, if you've kind of looked at ways the incentives, not just the capacity of governments, both local and national, can be changed. Thank you.
Other questions? We'll go right here, Sue. Thank you.
Hello, Rachel Trigo from USDA. And I was wondering if we could return to that question of agency, as well as sort of the relationship between taking lessons learned in a variety of different countries and applying them in a new program, contrasting that, or perhaps integrating that with how do you listen to what a community or a country is already doing and what works and how to scale that up. What's kind of the balance between bringing in new ideas and listening and scaling up what exists? Thanks.
We will address this round. So a couple of questions from Rajul on how, especially for the partners, on how investing in the GHI has influenced your work, and especially Connell about programming for resilience at Concern. A question from Danielle on the tension, the relationship between poor governance and capacity building and incentives. And finally, on the balance between new ideas and then listening and scaling up. So, Connell, do you want to start first?
Okay, I'll try. It's a difficult question, Rajul. In terms of the GHI and how it's influenced our programs and choices, I think it has been influential, because I think one of the things that it's done for Concern, in a sense, which is odd, is it's given us profile, but profile in a funny way. I mean, NGOs generally have been weak in evidence building and contributing to a global evidence base, if you like. And I think that's where it's changed people's heads about the discussion about where knowledge sits as part of an NGO. You know, going from just being purely action orientated, getting results on the ground, doing things for our target group, to actually contributing to the knowledge base about the kinds of things we're working on. And that's where I think the GHI has been very helpful for us as one of those incentivizers, if you like, of getting people to think much more around monitoring and evaluation, investing in evidence much more strongly. And I actually think as I'm meant to be in charge of strategy as well, I'm fairly sure that knowledge management will be a core part of our next strategic plan. I think this has been a driver of it. In terms of building capacity or reprogramming differently is a very difficult question, and it links a little bit to Rachel's question, I think. We have this constant tension and arguments with our council about this. And I actually had a meeting in Kampala recently, about 2 weeks ago, with staff from 11 countries. And what I was trying to do was to get them to think about nutrition, hunger and nutrition work in a different way. And what I was saying to them was, what happens is, in country, you're waiting for a donor call for proposals, and then you respond. So I think we need to be getting ahead of the game here. We need to be looking at global evidence and thinking about how we can contribute to that, and kind of how can we push out boundaries. Now, pushing out boundaries may be around innovation. This is, I think, speaks to Rachel's question. It can be about really trying new things, or looking, for example, at equality and gender and how that plays out in a resilience context. It could be combining things that haven't been combined previously. Or it could be actually saying, well, how the hell do we actually get coverage? How do we get scale on this? And actually, I think there's a very interesting, DFID, for example, has just come out with a call for proposals on this thing called BRACED, which is building reliance to community climate shocks and extremes. And I think what's really interesting is the way they have framed this call for proposal, which is really good. Firstly, it recognizes that a lot of the learning will be very contextual, but that they need to get learning about what works in particular contexts, but it needs to be done at scale. And so they've given a particular scale that would need to be achieved by consortia. So it's not just a small NGO pilot. They're now saying, you've done lots of pilots. We need you to be bringing it to at least 250,000 people. And then we need to get the lessons from those contextually and get them into the evidence base. So I think it's a roundabout discussion, but I think they're all quite interesting ways in terms of how we would reprogram. But the big tension for us really is this idea, I suppose, in the sense of a central strategy, saying things like, the 1,000 days evidence is there, the window of opportunity around stunting. Why don't we program on that? Versus people looking at their context, analysing the needs, and saying what's the most appropriate and what's the most needed thing to do here. And this tension always exists, and I think it always will exist. So what I was trying to do in Kampala was really trying to plant seeds in people of a bit of vision about where visionary programming would go, and then let them make the choices, because we're not centralized. We don't force people to do things that may not be contextually appropriate. It's a very long-winded answer. I don't know if it helps, but that's kind of where we're going with it. But I do think that the systemic reviews, the things like the Lancet series have influenced our programming, are getting people to think differently about the traditional ways that we used to program. Sorry,
Sure. On your question of how much do we listen and what do we bring in terms of new ideas, of course, traditionally, you know, we're trying to get as much, not just for our own development approaches, as much local knowledge into the game as possible, and also encouraging on enabling South-South knowledge transfer, which is sometimes the smartest way of dealing with challenges that happen in the South. Okay. And I'm always very nervous when I hear about capacity building, because very often we don't make the first step, which is capacity use. Okay, there's always in every situation there's a lot of capacities that can be utilized, and we're always in the danger of overlooking those. Okay, at the same time, I think the resilience framework shows that a lot of coping or even adapting strategies are challenged in a way that they don't work, maybe to the extent they used to work. So, you know, the globe is changing, the environmental threats are out there, and they're terrible for, you know, the farmers who used to be able to count on a certain regularity, for instance, on rain coming down at certain points in time, and this is not happening anymore. So of course there needs to be joint development of more appropriate responses. I guess, like Connell said, you know, knowledge transfer in all directions is going to be the key for any kind of successful development initiatives. Rajul, yes, we have this double function of both contributing to the GHI and benefiting from it. So some of the experiences we're trying to feed into the discussion. At the same time, the Global Hunger Index, both in terms of countries that are affected, do affect our work. We are phasing out of countries, of course, not every year. You know, you see the Comoros are doing well, so let's start programming there. This is not how it works, of course, but we're phasing out of a number of Latin American countries, for instance, because the situation is improving so much. And at the same time, also, I think we are reacting to the key topics that are being identified. And that's why we have a different topic every year, because it's such a valuable source of kind of inspiration to, I mean, like Connor has said, the idea, the issue of the first 1,000 days, the undernutrition of children or infants, has reshaped our program in focusing more on the nutritional value of our intervention for children in particular. So we do respond to that actually quite significantly. And last point on the current GHI, we have this resilience issue, and we looked at our Haiti program through this lens. We realized some things that we do work well, and some things obviously do not contribute to resilience as much as they could be. So there's a constant learning involved. And I think this is really a great product, not just because we're involved, but it gives a lot of this inspiration and ability to reflect on, you know, the many dimensions that contribute to poverty and, to hunger and malnutrition.
Quick,
No, I
do
don't
you have
know
anything?
anything.
Okay, Connell. Go ahead, Connell.
There was the tension on disincentives, Danielle's question, but that's really for
just to go back. So Rachel, just one thing on the that idea of listening to voices and scaling up. I think there's quite a lot of interesting work now happening on like community conversations. So for example, the work I talked about in Kenya there, we did a lot of that very qualitative work with community conversations as a methodology to get people to say what works in this context, what are the kinds of institutions you need for good disaster risk management. There's a lot of work happening on the DBC side on social and behavior change. Utilizing tools like barrier analysis very effectively now is beginning to say who's actually, it's a classic positive heart, positive deviance type of model, which is who are doing positive behaviors around, say, utilization of food and good nutrition, who are not, what are the reasons behind it. So I think we are investing in those kind of qualitative approaches, listening to why people are, doing well or not, and I think trying to scale them up. Scaling up of qualitative is the real challenge all of the time, and good anthropological approaches, and I think that's one of the real challenges for us. Going back then to our friend from IFPRI, I'm sorry, it was a very difficult question. Just in terms of the incentives, disincentives, what I would say is, in terms of incentivizing good governance, a really interesting question. I posit that our advocacy needs to change as NGOs. And governments are sick of us coming to them and saying, oh, you got to do this, you got to do that, stop doing this, stop doing that. They're just fed up with it. I think what we need to do is co-create solutions with government, and particularly government at district level. So, this is my vision of how it would work, and I think I've seen it working relatively well in somewhere like Ethiopia within technical ministries, where you actually work at a sub-level, district level. You work with civil society organizations and with government to identify barriers and issues. You're coming up jointly with solutions, both doing things, and we've done this very effectively in child survival, for example, with USAID grants on it. And then what happens is you're getting government people at a local level beginning to advocate for better governance and better issues. They're beginning to see the governance obstacles to them becoming more effective as part of that process. So that, to me, that's one form of incentivizing things, but I mean, it's a much bigger, difficult question than that, I'm sure.
All right, I did notice one more question up front. I don't know if you still had that. We have time maybe for one, possibly two at the most. So.
I really wanted to thank Derek. I think about 10 or 15 minutes ago, he said that people always underinvest in measurement because it's a public good, and I thought that was an excellent statement. And it's really ironic that given the profession that we work in a profession that's generous by nature, we tend to underinvest in public goods. That doesn't quite make sense to me. But I think it's a great statement, and I'm really curious. How can we incentivize or encourage investments in measurement? And from there, how can we encourage links, organizational and institutional links, so that sharing data and sharing measurement is encouraged? Because that would be a great thing, I think.
Question up front.
Yes, Tag Demet from the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. I just, in response to comments about measurement, there was a fairly bright guy named Einstein who said that everything you can measure doesn't count, and everything you can't measure does count. And there's also a good quote in contrast to Chris Barrett's comment, you become what you measure. And, part of what we're all trying to do in development is we're trying to develop a number of long-term issues. Resilience clearly is one of them. And the question is, resilience has a lot of impact beyond 1 or 2 years, beyond a controlled trial. How do you capture then the diffuse impacts of things like human capacity building, education, nutrition over a lifetime? Some of that work has been done. But it is really important that we don't lock ourselves into the fact that everything that's important is a short-term measure that can be captured.
Any other questions? We'll go to those two. I just want to make sure. All right, so 2 questions. One on how to encourage investment in measurement, and then another measurement-related question on how to capture the diffuse impacts of it. So, Derek, shall we start with you?
Yeah, so I mentioned kind of the public good failure of measuring resilience and of conducting these kind of sentinel systems. There are plenty of other failures too. I mean, one is, I think, a coordination failure. If we, my suggestion and the lines that Chris Barrett and I are thinking is that, we need these surveillance systems in only those countries that are most vulnerable to shocks. So if you look at developing countries, there'll be a huge bunch of developing countries that have, say, poverty rates above 20%. But within those poor countries, you'll find stark variation in terms of their vulnerability to shocks. I mean, you look at a map of Africa, you know that the Sahel and the Horn of Africa and, parts of southern Africa are more vulnerable to shocks. So we don't need to measure everywhere, in terms of kind of sentinel sites, although they would serve other purposes. But there's a coordination problem of who should do this. We know everybody will benefit, but who will actually agree on driving this forward? So that's an additional problem. You become what you measure. You could flip that around to kind of, I think, validate the point I made earlier. What do we do at the moment? We really conduct occasional household surveys in different literatures. So we do a demographic health survey every 4 or 5 years. We do a living standards measurements every 4 or 5 years. Can we say anything about seasonality from those surveys? No, because in that sense, we have become what we measured. So I'm not saying that the various indicators of resilience that we're proposing, the high frequency measurement will solve all these problems, but it will get us a much better picture of what we need to do and what the problems are.
Thank you. Wolfgang or Connell?
Well, it's difficult to contradict Einstein, so I won't even try. But I mean, it's quite obvious. I mean, we're working with proxy indicators. We're working with the roughly right principle. I mean, obviously, some things are obvious. When you have an earthquake in Haiti and 300,000 people die, and a week later you have an earthquake in Peru and 70 people die. Okay, there is a number of things that make a difference there, and we're trying to identify a few. How do you measure those progress in those societies? There's so many variables that play a role. Of course, well, we have scientists around the room, so we're expecting, of course, help there and assistance, and we need that. On the other hand, I think we're all, and I mean all, that includes the donors and the international community, we have to face that challenge. We have to demonstrate progress and result, and the willingness to invest is growing. Also with NGOs, I mean, Connell has given good examples, invest donor money, private donor money in this. Otherwise, we'll become obsolete if we're not able to demonstrate. This is all I can say. I mean, it's a difficult one.
Yeah, just on the Einstein and the measurement, I think what Derek is saying, like the 2-point measurement is limited in some ways, and I think it's, we are, for example, working with IFPRI on this realigning agriculture to improve nutrition in Zambia on stunting, which again is a randomized controlled trial. But what's useful about it also is that alongside the high-level baseline and endline comparison, we're also doing a process evaluation. So you're actually understanding why things are happening at the same time as you're measuring the change. And I think that balance of the qualitative quantitative is really important. In terms of incentivizing measurement, I think it's like a big stick at the moment rather than incentivizing. The Irish Aid are, banging us results. You've got to do it, and that's rather a big incentive from your donor. But whether it's the right level of measurement is another question.
All right. Well, I think the truck may be giving us a hint outside. So I'd just like to take a moment to thank all of our speakers today, and also all of the people from across the 3 organizations who worked so hard to produce this year's index and to get the word out about it. So thank you very, very much, and thank all of you for coming this afternoon.